Imagine discovering that the ship itself is alive as soon as you board a luxurious cruise. Passengers disappear, cabins disappear, and shadows follow you around. 4 terrifying tales that demonstrate why some journeys should never be undertaken will be told to you tonight. Pay close attention and try not to blink. The nightmare is about to start, so turn down the lights, push the bell button, sign up for Midnight Outcry, and get ready. Could you endure the sinister secrets of the ship? Story 1. Before boarding the Oblivion Star, I didn't think haunting ships existed. You can call me Daniel Ortiz. As a Miami-based documentary filmmaker, I'm accustomed to following storms, legends, and deserted locations. I didn't expect to record a nightmare when I went up for this opulent cruise to make a lifestyle unique. The ship was beautiful on the first night. Orchestral music drifted from the ballroom. Neon lights shimmered along the decks, and the aroma of the ocean mixed with laughing. With cameras in hand, I documented every moment, telling the camera about my impressions. Everything appeared to be ideal. Too ideal. At midnight, the first strangeness showed up. A apparently disused chamber, cabin 1313, was illuminated. Behind the curtains, I noticed a shadow that was moving regularly, as though it were carrying out a ritual. The door was locked when I got there, but I could hear gentle chanting coming from within. Caution gave way to curiosity. I zoomed in while filming from the hallway. Passengers I didn't recognize came at the window, their lips moving in quiet prayer, their eyes empty. Then they vanished. All that was seen when the door opened by itself was darkness. The hallways started to shift. Hallways looped back into themselves. Walls moved and stairwells twisted. The crew gave a kind grin, but there was something unsettling in their eyes, an implicit understanding of what was going on. "Don't go near 1313, one stewardess said to herself. "It decides." I went back to my cabin and watched the video again. Sleep was impossible because of the shadows that appeared where none existed, the whispering that covered my narration, and the slogan, "Join us," that appeared in practically every frame. Every wind blast against the porthole and every creak sounded like a warning. The most horrifying realization came to me then. The ship wasn't only haunted, it had life. It picked its victims, it felt, it watched. I had a plan by morning. I would look into 1313, document everything, and try to figure out what the ship was looking for. However, I knew in my heart that the Oblivion Star forbade curiosity without repercussions. The vessel awaited. Be patient. Making calculations. And I couldn't ignore it because I was already among its viewers. I felt the presence of cabin 1313 calling to me, vibrating through my chest like a faint hum. I slipped along the winding hallways, camera ready, every step resonating strangely. The ship appeared to change all around me, with shadows creeping along the rails, stairways looping back, and walls lengthening. The entrance to the cabin was ajar when I arrived. The salty ocean air mixed with a chilly, metallic smell that leaked out. My flashlight flickered dimly across the room as I pushed it open. The damp floor within reflected the dim light. There was a circle of motionless water in the middle of the room. From the surface, faces appeared passengers I had seen on board, some grinning, some yelling inaudibly. Around the circle, puppets dressed in crew uniforms stood, their vacant eyes focused on the pool, making gestures that I couldn't comprehend, but felt compelled to document. I lifted my camera and focused on it. The pool shook. I noticed my own image, but it wasn't correct. Pale skin, empty eyes, and a small, derisive smile. From the ocean came whispers that called my name. Panic grabbed at my stomach, but I pushed myself to breathe. The captain stepped silently on the damp floor and appeared out of nowhere. "You ought not to have come," he uttered quietly. "However, given that you have, pay close attention. The selected serve, the ship selects." Abruptly, the water rushed upward, forming liquid hands that extended toward me. I staggered back and started recording wildly. The shadows along the walls started to twist toward me as the puppets moved forward. The ship was living, surviving on dread and observation. I recalled that denial could postpone it, according to recommendations from earlier footage I had taken. The hands paused as I whispered to myself, "I am nothing. You cannot see me." The darkness faltered. It worked for a while. I moved back to the hallway, but the ship's labyrinthine design had changed even further. Stairwells wound in endless circles, doors led nowhere, and the murmurs pursued me unrelentingly. Behind me, cabin 1313 was still there, blazing dimly, like if it were inevitable. I came to the terrible realization that the ship was more than just a body trap. Awareness was stuck. It preyed on people who watched, wrote, or were afraid, and I was already marked by it tonight. I realized that survival was about surviving, hiding, and hoping the ship forgot not about escaping when I heard the whispers, "Join us, join us," echoing inside my head even as I ascended to the higher deck. Its shortcoming, however, had never been patience. There was no comfort on the upper deck. Waves crashed bone jarringly against the hull as lightning tore over the horizon. Despite the darkness being broken by my camera and flashlight, every shadow appeared to be alive, scuttling around the walls and blending with the rain and wind. It was hard to avoid the ship's presence everywhere. The puppets were then visible to me. They were climbing walls and gliding along railings in rows, staring at me with hollow eyes. Their wooden joints made no sound, but every stride they took echoed. Behind them, the captain's shadow darted, silent and ever-present. The deck bent and twisted, making it impossible for me to run. The same location was reached by staircases. The hallways went on and on. A hand of water surged from below, frigid and inexorable, curling down the deck. Panic clutched at me, but I forced my breath steady, repeating the chant, "I do not exist. You cannot see me. I am nothing." Inside it, the faces of missing passengers glistened, their mouths opening in quiet cries. I came to understand that the ship distorted vision and bent reality itself to capture me, in addition to manipulating the physical environment. I saw my reflection in the porthole as I staggered toward the viewing deck, hollow-eyed, pale, and grinning. I felt sick to my stomach. If I failed, I would have been just another member of the ship's chorus and another witness who would be stuck there forever. Then a small, narrow opening near the stern developed, possibly a maintenance exit. I ran in its direction. The puppets moved forward behind me, their motions fluid and seemingly lifelike. My determination was put to the test as the ship itself appeared to pulse, directing me to the brink. Upon opening the hatch, I discovered a hallway adorned with mirrors. Dozens of me were depicted in each reflection, all of them smiling, pale, and imprisoned. I saw an endless number of alternative outcomes as the puppets moved around and changed the visuals. My heart pounded. Here, reality itself served as a weapon. I willed myself to be invisible as I closed my eyes and chanted the mantra more quickly. The puppets had stopped when I opened them. The water drained away. I approached a side deck by moving cautiously and step by step. My face was battered by the wind, but I saw the vast sea for the first time. Not right away, at least no shadows followed. I collapsed to the deck, soaked, gasping, and trembling. I was temporarily alive, but I knew I was marked by the ship. The Oblivion Star takes a long time to kill. It waits, it watches, and one day it says it's fully chosen. The puppets waited while the storm raged and the waves crashed. The storm had gotten out of control. The hull was beaten by waves. The deck was illuminated by ragged flashes of lightning, and the wind brought a chorus of unnaturally human whispering. Wet and trembling, I clutched my camera, understanding that escape meant more than simply running away. It meant surviving, hiding, and becoming invisible. What had appeared to be my escape route, the side deck, narrowed into a mirror-lined corridor. Each mirror was a warped image of me, smiling, hollow-eyed, and pale. Along the rails and walls, puppets moved with smooth, unnatural motions. At the far end, the captain's shadow lingered, eyes fixed on mine, serene and ever-present. From below, a hand of water rushed up and clawed at my ankles, revealing the faces of those who had disappeared. I saw what awaited those the ship claimed as silent screams twisted in the reflections. Then I realized that the Oblivion Star was more than just a body trap. It imprisoned mind, identity, and awareness. Eventually, every onlooker joined in its rite. I am nothing. You cannot see me. I do not exist. I muttered my mantra, and for a little moment, the water receded and the shadows wavered. The mirrors began to ripple, though. With a broader smile, my reflection moved closer and reached for me. The camera rolled as I staggered backward and fell onto the damp deck, catching every improbable movement and every twisted reflection. Resistance prolongs the inevitable, the skipper said over the wind. Acceptance garanties eternity. I became aware that although I had physically survived the storm, my consciousness and thoughts were already integrating with the ship. It was fueled by everything I had noticed, every terrified look, and every note I had made. Interminably, the Oblivion Star waits patiently, and I was aware that it would eventually take me completely, not in a violent way. My identity, my consciousness, and my dread would all become part of the ship's never-ending routine. Whispers filled my thoughts as I fell to my knees, waves crashing over my legs. The puppets stood motionless and silent at the edge of the corridor, waiting for the ship to fully select me. Calmly, my reflection grinned in the porthole. There was no way out. There would be no way out. The puppets waited while the ship pulsed and the storm roared. "Welcome on board!" Story 2. I assumed that cruises were meant to be leisurely, a week away from the bustle of life, sun, and sea. I'm Naomi Chen, a Los Angeles-based travel vlogger, and I reserved the celestial wave to film opulent interiors and far-flung ports for my channel. I didn't want nightmares. I wanted light, laughter, and movie-like sunsets. The ship was beautiful on the first evening. The crew greeted guests with perfect smiles. Polished decks shined under the lowering sun, and chandeliers glittered like stars. I strolled the decks, recording brief snippets and narrating them enthusiastically, oblivious to the subtle uneasiness that was seeping into the ship's nooks and crannies. The first oddity emerged by nightfall. There was a quiet hum from the lower decks. Neither the seas nor the engine were to blame. Just a note that seemed to vibrate inside my chest, low and vibrating. I picked up my camera out of curiosity and followed it. The hallways wound in an odd way. The doors I had previously passed had vanished, and in their stead were slender hallways that led to dimly lighted chambers. When I gazed directly at the humanoid shapes formed by the flickering shadows moving against the grain of light, they melted. I discovered an antique theater in one area that was completely intact despite being abandoned. A lone spotlight illuminated a stage in front of rows of red velvet seats. A human-sized, pallid puppet wearing a captain's uniform was on the stage. "It has dark holes for eyes," I heard it whisper, "You're next," as it cocked its head in my direction without moving its lips. I staggered back, my heart pounding. Lights flickered, the ship creaked, and the buzzing intensified, sounding almost like a chorus of voices joining together. I made an effort to convince myself it was my imagination. However, the cameras captured everything, including whispers, movement, and shadows that were invisible to the human eye. When I got back to my cabin, I discovered something impossible. Moments I hadn't captured were already showing on my camera footage. Unknown passenger silhouettes, corridors that went on forever in the dark, and my own reflection grinning menacingly. And then there was a knock. 3 slow, methodical taps on the door of my cabin. I went cold. There should have been nobody there. I slowly walked up, and the hallway was deserted as I peered through the peephole. But from the opposite side, the knocking persisted. In a chilly rush of panic, I recognized that the celestial wave was more than just a ship. It was a living thing that thrived on dread, presence, and attention, and it had somehow picked me up. I lay in bed with my camera next to me that night and listened to the humming become louder. Shadows twisted and blended together as they moved around the walls. My mirror in my porthole was smiling and welcoming, but it was no longer me. and I realized that once the ship makes a decision, it cannot be avoided. There is no sailing on the celestial wave. It waits. It observes. It also takes. I had trouble falling asleep. I was reminded that the celestial wave was conscious of me by every ship creak and wind whisper against the viewport. I have to comprehend it, I decided. I followed the faint humming that had begun on the first night, camera in hand, and headed for the lower decks. The hallways curved strangely. Doors led into rooms that were incomprehensible, shadows flashed at angles that were impossible to reconcile, and stairwells arose where none had been. My flashlight beam faltered against the encroaching darkness as the temperature dropped and the air became wet with the odor of salt and aged wood. I found dozens of puppets that were just like the one I had seen on stage in a storage area. Their faces were frozen, their eyes hollow, and they all wore the captain's or crew's uniform. One cocked its head slightly, barely perceptibly, as I moved closer. I was unable to see minor motions with my own eyes, but my camera captured them. The whispers then reached my ears. This time, it's clearer. You're next. Join us. I heard the sound coming from the floor, the walls, and even the air itself. The shadows themselves were moving, reaching for me, their fingers silently scraping at the area surrounding me as I spun, my heart thumping. I was abruptly pulled toward a circular hatch in the middle of the deck that I had not before noticed. The ship bent reality to lead me where it desired, and the floor beneath me rippled like water. Despite my best efforts, every stride forward seemed unavoidable. When the hatch was opened, a chamber full of water, black and rippling strangely, was seen. Under the surface, the faces of missing people drifted, their mouths moving in silent supplication, their eyes empty. As though orchestrating a symphony, the puppets stood along the perimeter, their hands up, interacting with the water. I noticed a figure in the middle of the pool, my own reflection, pale, with empty eyes and lips twisted into a warm, silent grin. I felt sick to my stomach. The ship captured existence, mind, and identity in addition to bodies. Calm and serene, the captain's footsteps reverberated around the room. He said, "The ritual is only strengthened by resistance. You might run, but the ship always gets what it wants." I had to force myself to think despite the panic. The journal I had previously discovered suggested that if one avoided expressing fear or acknowledgement, the ship's influence might be postponed. The water hesitated, and I said to myself, "I am not here. I do not exist. You cannot see me." Shadows stumbled. For a moment, the puppets seemed perplexed and froze. Encouraged, I cautiously backed away until I came to a maintenance ladder that led to the top decks, being careful not to acknowledge any of the figures. The pandemonium below was reflected in the storm overhead. Waves beat the hull as lightning flashed, but for a split second, I felt almost safe. At that moment, I came to the horrifying realization that the celestial wave did not instantly kill. It thrived on recognition, alertness, and dread. You could survive, but only if you didn't show up to its consciousness. I also realized that tonight was just the beginning as I made my way to the top deck. The ship waited. It waited. It also constantly asserted that it was chosen. There was no comfort on the upper deck. The horizon was torn into sharp pieces of silver by lightning as waves smashed against the hull like enormous fists. The flashlight beam darted over the damp deck as my hands trembled around the camera. Unnaturally, shadows stretched across the walls, blending with the rain and wind. I came to understand that the ship's awareness extended beyond the lower decks and into every nook, cranny, and reflection. The puppets were then visible to me, crawling around railings and sliding across damp metal. They came out of the corners. Their motions were eerily fluid, and their hollow eyes were fixed on me. Behind them, the captain's silent, uncompromising shadow moved, directing the ceremony. The deck twisted under me as I attempted to run. The wind whispered my name as the steps twisted into staircases that headed back to the same location, with endless corridors. One puppet glided toward me, palm outstretched, and I pushed my breath steady, remembering the chant, "I do not exist. You cannot see me." Panic clawed at me. With a hollow click, each joint of its wooden fingers cracked as they flexed strangely. Light bounced off the slick surface of my camera, causing it to flash without conscious thought. It flinched for a second, but the shadows rushed forward, quicker, more numerous. From below, the water rose, reaching for me as it curled across the deck like wet fingers. Inside, the faces of those who had disappeared shimmered, their lips opening in mute screams. I came to understand that the ship did more than simply alter reality. It also distorted perception, producing a nightmare that was intended to destroy the mind before the body. I staggered back, clinging to a railing as the storm intensified. My reflection in the porthole was lighted by lightning, and I caught a glimpse of her, me, the same serene, hospitable grin curled around pale, hollow-eyed lips. My chest constricted. If I failed, this was my destiny. Then I saw a tiny, nearly invisible opening toward the stern, an outlet for maintenance. It may loop back within, or it may lead out. I had no choice but to try. The puppets followed like slippery shadows as I ran toward it. The hatch opened into a small mirror-lined hallway. Not only did each reflection depict me, but dozens of different Mays, pale, smiling, imprisoned, silently grasping. My heart pounded. The ship was showing me the inevitable, teasing me. I made myself invisible by forcing my eyes down and chanting the phrase more quickly. I arrived at the end and pushed open a side deck door. The wind tore at my garments, and the rain slapped my face. I saw the open sea for the first time, black and boundless, but there were no shadows to follow. At the threshold, the puppets had halted. Through the storm, the captain's voice murmured, "You endure, for now." I fell to the deck, shaking, gasping, and soaked. I was aware of the truth, but I had survived the encounter. The celestial wave waits rather than merely ensnaring bodies. It observes. It chooses its next casualty. And one day it would completely take me, with no escape, no hiding, and no mantra. The ship waited while the storm raged and the waters pulsed. The storm continued to rage. Thunder rolled like some giant predator's snarl, and lightning slashed the sky in sharp flashes. Wet, tired, and with my heart pounding so loudly it sounded like the ship could hear, I held my camera to my chest. Not only was the celestial wave all around me, but it was also inside of me. It was whispering, probing, pushing the boundaries of my terror, and I could feel it in my bones. What had appeared as a potential escape, the side deck, narrowed into an impassable passageway. Along the walls, shadows formed humanoid shapes that reflected my actions. I felt as though the ship itself was directing every movement I took. Once more, the puppets emerged silently from the rails and walls, their hollow eyes fixed on me. The shadows stumbled as I tried the chant, "I do not exist. You cannot see me. I am nothing." The water drained away. For a moment, I thought I was alive. The mirror chamber followed, though. Though smaller than I recalled, it was jam-packed with reflections. There were dozens of me, all white, grinning, with vacant eyes. Every road lured me back, despite my best efforts to turn away. The puppets moved smoothly around the mirrors, changing and twisting the reflections to reveal futures I didn't want to witness. And the ocean waited, the ship throbbed, and the storm roared in every reflection. At the far end, the captain emerged, serene, his dark eyes meeting mine. "You can fight back, you can live, but eventually the ship will take you." Each traveler joins in on the chorus. A hand of water rushed forward from the mirrors and grabbed my ankle, saying, "It is inevitable." I stumbled and almost fell into the reflecting pool as I yelled. The water's swirling motion, the puppets reaching, and my own happy reflection were all captured on video. I learned the ship's rule: resistance delays the inevitable, but never stops it. Clinging to the railings, I sprinted blindly while chanting my mantra more quickly. The mirrors twisted and the puppets multiplied, displaying an endless number of my conceivable outcomes, each one more terrifying than the last. I came to understand that the celestial wave was not solely fueled by presence or dread. Identity was its food source. It claimed that each passenger lost themselves and became a part of its consciousness. I finally passed out on the upper deck, gasping, shivering, and drenched. There was a respite in the storm. With their eyes still on me, the puppets waited as they drew away into the darkness. Through the wind, the captain's quiet, deep voice said, "Endurance is temporary. Acceptance endures forever." I peered through the porthole. I looked back at my smiling, hollow-eyed, pale reflection, and I realized, for the first time, that I was not free. Yes, I had made it through the night, but I was marked by the ship. I would never go. Not really. Not without joining the celestial wave itself, and the puppets' never-ending ritual. The puppets calmly waited while the storm raged, and the waves crashed. I immediately realized that I was the ship's next narrative. Its patience was limitless, and its hunger was boundless. Welcome on board. Story 3. I believed I understood fear. It was enough to make my skin crawl, I thought. I had already stepped onto the eternal horizon at that point. Marcus Hale is my name. I joined this research cruise as a marine biologist from Seattle with the goal of learning more about coral reefs in the Caribbean. Instead of nightmares, I wanted adventure, data, and possibly a few viral images. On the first night, everything appeared to be as usual. The crew greeted us with practiced smiles. The sun sunk into the ocean like molten gold, and passengers laughed at the deck bar. I had a little cabin in a narrow alcove with a porthole overlooking limitless waves. As I unpacked my research gear, I considered the coral surveys I would do first thing in the morning. However, I heard a slight tapping when I woke up that night. The ship wasn't settling. Like fingers on metal, it was methodical and gentle. I rolled over, assuming it was another late-arriving passenger. The rumors, however, followed. Syllables in a cadence that seemed almost sentient, but not words I could grasp. I sneaked out of my cabin curious. The tapping followed me, faster than I could keep up with the empty corridors. I leaned my back against the wall and saw a shadow separate from the railing. It was a man with black eyes and no features that glinted in the emergency lights. When I blinked, it disappeared. I gently brought it up to a fellow traveler the following morning. Her expression tightened as she froze. "You also witnessed it?" she muttered. "They dislike attention. What is it that dislikes attention?" She merely shook her head when I asked. "You'll get it soon." "I didn't get it." "Not quite yet." Later, when I went back over my notes and pictures, I saw something that couldn't be true. Photographs obtained in broad daylight of the seas surrounding the ship revealed deformed shapes beneath the waves. Legs, faces, and unimaginable motions. I initially believed it to be a camera bug or water refraction. However, as I continued to look, I became increasingly aware that the figures were observing the ship and us. The tapping came back after dark, louder and more forceful. Unnatural shadows extended along the walls. Corridors twisted like ribbons, and doors appeared where none had previously existed. Furthermore, the whispers were no longer arbitrary. My name was being called. A shiver went through my body. There was something about this cruise that wasn't natural or scientific. It had life, observing, feeding, awaiting. Furthermore, I was clueless about how long it had been waiting or how long it would allow me to depart. The sensation that I was being watched persisted. The water appeared darker and heavier each time I looked out to sea, as though something beneath it was stirring with expectation. All of a sudden, my research tools felt insufficient, not for biology, but for survival. I followed the voices that night. They took me to the lower cargo decks, which are meant to be empty and designated as off-limits. The air had an odd metallic tinge and was heavy with moist salt. With the help of my flashlight, I was able to see containers stacked so high that the shadows between them seemed to be alive. Then I noticed it. A figure moved softly between the crates, tall, featureless, dark eyes reflecting the faint light. It tilted its head in faux inquiry and halted when it sensed me. I could hear my heartbeat. My feet were freezing, but I wanted to run. Vibrating through the metal decks was a low hum. The shadows gathered and writhed like liquid as the figure moved. Semi-human faces with lips that opened in wordless screams were formed by shapes that appeared from the floor and walls. They were captured by my camera, but the shapes were hardly discernible through the lens. "Join us," came to me in a now clear whisper. I staggered back, and the deck below me shook like water. I came to see that the ship itself was living, surviving on presence, terror, and observation. Not only were the figures eerie, but they were also parts of the ship's body and consciousness. The captain suddenly materialized at the end of the hallway. Every stride seemed like a drumbeat inside my head, but it was calm, even casual. He whispered, "You shouldn't have seen this. However, now that you have, you are a part of the equilibrium. Witnesses are needed for the ship." It feeds on them. Fear flared. Doors twisted and passageways looped ceaselessly as I raced, the shadows grasping for me. The muttering became louder and merged into a deafening chorus as I approached the central room of the cargo hold. And there it was. A black, deep pool of water rippled with hundreds of faces. Some were passengers, and some were crew. Everyone was imprisoned within the ship's psyche. Their tongues moved softly as their gaze followed me. And my own reflection, a dark figure in the middle, it smiled. I became aware of the terrible reality. The ship did more than merely pick up corpses. It encapsulated identity, awareness, and presence, and I was already being claimed by it. I ran and discovered a maintenance ladder that led to the upper decks. The murmurs turned into shouts that vibrated in my chest and overlapped and echoed. I was certain that the ship was aware of my attempt to flee and was using the doors, the hallways, and even the outside waves to keep me within. Black and molten amid a sudden storm, the water extended eternally out to the observation deck. Lightning sliced the horizon into jagged silver, and waves whipped the sides. Like a living creature, the eternal horizon moaned and yielded to the will of whoever had possessed it. And I realized that the ship travels through perception, fear, and memory, in addition to the ocean. Even if they believe they are escaping, anyone who boards it becomes a part of it. I had no idea how far I could run. I could feel the murmurs now, flooding my head, tugging at my thoughts, reminding me that the ship will pick my offering very soon. I realized I couldn't run any longer. Everything about the ship was there. The pounding beat beneath the decks, the whispering breeze, the shadows in the passageways. All of our instincts begged to survive, but instinct was insufficient on its own. If I hoped to have any chance of escaping, I needed to comprehend the ship. I made my way back to the cargo hold where the pool had materialized, but this time I took my time and avoided looking directly at the shadowy creatures. With a pen and paper in one hand and a flashlight in the other, I had my camera ready. I required proof, something material to validate my observations, and even a hint as to how to live. When I got close, the pool roiling fiercely. Silently, faces screamed and clawed at the air as they rushed higher. I saw a tiny diary floating among them, wet but undamaged. I picked it up and opened it. Names, dates, pictures, decades of travel. Some crew members changed. Some passengers disappeared, all engrossed in the same routine that now reached for me. The final line, "The ship requires acknowledgement," made me shiver. It is fed by presence. Don't fight. I then understood that my attempts to flee could just hasten the process, adding those who strive to flee to the chorus. The ship caught awareness, terror, and identity in addition to bodies. It was being fueled by my panic. Behind me, the captain showed up, unflappable. He remarked, "Understanding comes too late. Some people quarrel, some give up." I took pictures of the diary and the pool in the hopes that the flash might somehow break up the shadows. Both are equally useful to the ship. It worked for a while. Shapes faltered, faces flinched, and the chanting faltered. The water, a living mass, then rushed toward me and drew me in. I fought to get out, but the hallways turned, doors vanished, and stairwells went on forever. The ship had turned into a maze that was alive and intelligent, influencing reality itself, and the storm outside reflected the mayhem within. I had to think strategically out of desperation. The journal reminded me that the ship needed presence, recognition, and terror. Maybe I could live if I could keep my composure and ignore my panic. The shadows paused as I spoke to myself, a mantra. You are not here. You are not seen. You do not exist. The chant stumbled. Confusion caused faces in the pool to twist and ripple. Careful not to recognize any of them, I backed away until I came to a service ladder that led to the upper deck. I ascended, fighting the pull of invisible hands with every step. By the time I arrived at the observation deck, a sudden storm had swept across the water, which seemed to go on forever. Lightning illuminated the black shapes of men floating just below the surface as waves whipped ferociously. That's when I realized that escape wasn't about distance. It has nothing to do with concealment. You were not allowed to leave the ship. The only way to survive was to use guile, denial, and mental fortitude. However, the ship remained patient, and its hunger never went away. Although the immediate threat had passed, the murmurs were still present in my head, telling me that the eternal horizon would wait, observe, and finally take me. And I was positive that it would be absolute when it made the decision, with lightning slicing the horizon into jagged silver and waves taller than the ship itself. The storm outside had grown monstrous. With my heart thumping, I gripped my journal and camera, every instinct telling me that the eternal horizon was listening to my thoughts and following my terror. I was constantly reminded that it just took one mistake to be claimed by the murmurs that were echoing, overlapping, and chanting my name inside my skull. I was aware that there were no doors leading to safety and no running. In order to capture me, the ship itself had turned into a maze that warped reality. Stairwells twisted back on themselves, corridors stretched endlessly, and shadows flickered in unthinkable ways. The ship's consciousness, the pulse beneath it all, was pulsing with a hunger that intensified with each heartbeat of fear I experienced. I made an effort to fight, to resist, but the water first materialized at my feet, moving like a live thing along the deck. Shapes emerged, the faces of the missing passengers, black-eyed, hollow crew members, mute mouths moving in silent supplications, all reaching for me. At the far end of the deck, the captain seemed composed. His gaze pierced mine. You are unable to go away. I recalled the journal statement regarding acknowledgement. You are already a part of the cycle. Maybe I might live, if not flee, if I denied my dread and my recognition. In an attempt to remove myself from the ship's perception, I muttered the chant once more. You do not exist. You are not here. You are nothing. The water paused. The darkness faltered. It felt like the ship was trying me, because for a brief instant, the storm seemed to stop and the waves slowed. Despite the clutching hands hovering just out of reach, I took a timid step forward. Then something terrible appeared my reflection in a ripple in the pool in the middle of the deck. However, it wasn't me. Pale skin, hollow eyes, and lips curving into a quiet, serene smile. I got it right away. If I were to be claimed by the ship, I would become this person, the living embodiment of its consciousness, a part of the ceremonial chorus that kept it going. I staggered back, slipping, as the water rushed forward, snagging me in its freezing clutches. I let out a scream, but the storm, the muttering, and the ship's mind overpowered my voice. The deck moved under me, creating a black staircase that led to nowhere. Then the storm was abruptly broken by sunlight. The calm oceans went on forever. The ship shone as though nothing had occurred. I was able to breathe. I felt a wave of relief. Maybe I was still alive. Until the logbook on the cabin desk caught my attention. The cabin door sounded 3 gentle knocks. It was open, blank, save for the line that had emerged in fresh ink. Marcus Hale, taken. I saw eyes that weren't mine when my reflection in the porthole froze. Waiting, smiling, hollow. At that moment, I understood that freedom was not survival, because I had already been taken by the ship. It now included my awareness, my terror, and my consciousness. Waiting patiently and eternally, the eternal horizon will take another when it makes a decision. Welcome on board. Story 4. I didn't think curses existed. Ghost stories weren't genuine. They were for YouTube videos and campfires. I was not yet on the Aurora tide at that time. I'm Lila Martinez, a Miami-based freelance photographer who signed up for this Caribbean cruise in order to take pictures of ship interiors and sunsets for a travel magazine. Instead of nightmares, I wanted color, vitality, and laughing. The first day went flawlessly. Families chuckled at the pool. The crew greeted me with polished smiles, and sunlight glinted off the pristine decks. I always had my camera with me, taking shots of the elaborate railings, the magnificent dining room, and the glistening seas beyond the bow. Everything appeared to be too normal. The first strange event occurred at nightfall. I was looking through pictures in my cabin when I discovered something odd. A man seated at dinner with me in every picture, grinning courteously. Yet he wasn't there when I looked back at the table log or outside the frame. I initially believed it to be a camera bug. However, the following morning at breakfast, a child giggling pointed to him. "Mom, that's hilarious. Last night I don't remember him." The staff steered clear of my inquiries. Their eyes darted to the top decks, then back to me, and they chatted in low voices, yet their smiles never wavered. I strolled over to the top deck that night. The ocean seemed to go on forever as the sunset tinted the sky scarlet and gold. A faint, incomprehensible murmur coiled about my ears on a low wind, until a shadow moved by behind me. I believed I had dreamed it. A towering, motionless man stood at the railing. "Hey?" I made a quiet call. No response. Only the sound of the waves. Uneasy, I went back to my cabin. As though the ship itself were whispering secrets, the muttering came back that night, stronger and wrapped around the vents. My photos started to reveal things I hadn't noticed, such doors that weren't there, stairwells that seemed to go on forever, and passengers with half-hidden features and vacant, staring eyes. By night 3, reality began to crumble. The ship appeared to expand overnight, with halls growing longer, stairwells steeper, and corridors winding like labyrinths, and passengers I had spoken to vanished without a trace. The captain's speeches on deck seemed forced and phony, as if he were reading from a screenplay in a foreign tongue, yet the crew never acknowledged it. The journal was then located. There was a leather-bound book in the lounge, moist and smelled of salt and something metal, hidden under a floor panel. Detailed reports of past expeditions were crammed into its pages, complete with names, dates, and even images that uncannily resembled mine. According to the writings, the ship would sail into endless storms, passengers would disappear, crew members would change, and ceremonies would be held on the lower decks. Reading the final entry, which was dated the day before my trip, "The new passenger will see everything. The ship knows. The offering begins," made me shiver. Outside, the wind howled, shaking the portholes, and I sensed a presence in the lounge's shadows. There's something awaiting, observing. It dawned on me then that this cruise was no typical holiday. One traveler at a time, the Aurora Tide not only navigated the oceans, but also ate them up. And it would begin with me tonight. The journal was on my mind constantly. I kept thinking about every word, every picture, and every entry, like a spooky slideshow. The ship was a predator, not your typical cruise liner, and I was already in its clutches. I waited until the majority of travelers had gone to their cabins that evening. With my camera in hand, I crept out and headed for the lower decks via the winding corridors. I couldn't understand the voices coming from the vents. They were half human, half something else, and they had a sense of urgency that made my chest constrict. It was chilly in the lower hallways, wet. I sensed a peculiar resistance, as if the ship itself were gently pulling me back, and the air had a fragrance similar to seaweed and iron. However, I persisted. What the journal reported, I had to witness for myself. I discovered a stairwell at the end of the hallway that wasn't marked on any deck maps. Darkness spiraled down its metal steps. Once more, the chanting began, softly at first, then increasing in time with my heartbeat. I went down slowly, my breath shuddering and my steps echoing. There was a compartment behind the stairwell. Flickering lanterns revealed ancient, curling walls covered in symbols. Despite the lack of a breeze, a shallow puddle of water in the middle swirled strangely. Beneath the surface, shadows moved passengers I knew, trapped, eyes vacant, faces gray. Some floated peacefully, while others reached out to me. The crew was also present, chanting in unison while standing in a perfect circle around the pool. Their attitudes were calm but frighteningly foreign, and their eyes were black. Hands reached out to the water, tinkering with it, as though directing the forms inside. Above them all, the captain's serene, authoritative, and unwavering presence loomed. I took a deep breath. The journal hadn't overstated anything. It was a custom, a meal, and I had fallen right in the middle of it. A surge of energy from the circle pushed me forward despite my best efforts to back off. My camera clattered against the floor after slipping out of my hands. I froze when the captain said, "You shouldn't be here," in a low voice that reverberated around the room. "However, the ship has selected you. It never really leaves anyone it comes into contact with. You'll see. You'll serve." The water rushed, creating clawing hands that reached up for me. The floor twisted under my feet as I staggered back, leading me closer. Panic seized over. In an attempt to disrupt the custom, I snatched up a light and swung it furiously. After hissing and momentarily withdrawing, the shadows rushed once more, this time with greater speed and strength. I understood that the ship wasn't merely consuming corpses. It was thriving on recognition, fear, and attention. It grew stronger with each glance I had given the shadows and each pounding of fear. Then I noticed a different face in the pool, my own reflection, pallid, with wide eyes and lips curved into a silent scream. My chest constricted. In that moment, I realized that if I stayed, I would entirely disappear into it. I ran. The murmurs and shadows followed, tugging at the corners of my thoughts as we upped the stairs and passed through winding hallways that seemed to go on forever. The chanting behind me became louder, almost joyous, as though the ship was celebrating my dread. Gasping and covered in salt and perspiration, I made it to the main deck. The sea was sliced into sharp silver by lightning, and the horizon was black with storm clouds rolling indefinitely. With every wave, the ship bent slightly, creaking as if it were alive. I was unsure about my ability to make it through the night. All of my instincts told me to flee, hide, and run, but I knew that the ship was everywhere. In the shadows, the water, and the wind. I was already moved by it, and it would carry on its hunt tomorrow. I didn't get any sleep that evening. Every ship creak, far-off splash, and wind whisper across the viewport served as a reminder that I was not alone and that the Aurora Tide was already aware that I was awake. I came up with a strategy by dawn as my reflection in the cabin mirror gazed back at me. Pallid, hollow-eyed lips pulled together as if to tell me, "There's no escape." To demonstrate the outside world that this wasn't a nightmare, I needed evidence, something concrete. Having managed to survive, I packed my camera into my bag in the hopes of documenting my observations of the lower decks. However, the ship appeared to reorganize itself even as I dropped. Doors appeared where none had been. Stairwells twisted, and shadows flashed at inconceivable angles. The chanting started out slowly before picking up speed to match my heartbeat. I trailed behind it, squatting down in the hallways to escape the crew, who now floated instead of walked, their mouths quivering in that unending, unsettling smile. Although they remained silent, they exuded caution. No passenger should ever be in a situation where I was trespassing. The rite was underway at the chamber. Hundreds of faces were trapped beneath the surface of the pool, their mouths moving in silent pleadings as it shimmered with a sickly light. I was horrified to see that they weren't merely illusions, but rather partially real, tied to the ship by ritual and terror, as hands made of water sought upward like frantic fingers. The captain saw me right away. He did not yell or move rapidly. He just held up a hand, and the water reacted. Outward surges of waves snarled at me like a living creature. I almost fell into the water after stumbling and dodging. A swirl of hands, faces, and shadows was captured by my camera as it clattered to the deck. "You have no business being here," the captain muttered. "I understood what you said. But now that you are, you can either serve or vanish. This has nothing to do with murder. It has to do with surrender, compliance." The ship didn't require mercy, so it didn't have any. I recalled a pattern I had seen in the journal. Based on recognition, fear, and observation, the ship selected its offerings. It thrived on acknowledgement. I might be able to survive if I ignored it and pretended it wasn't real, but it would take over my entire being if I resisted, if I fought in public. I took a chance. As if reciting a mantra, I squatted low, avoiding eye contact with the crew, and edged around the walls while mumbling to myself, "You don't exist. You don't exist. You don't exist." The shadows paused. The chant stumbled. The water pulsed more slowly, but faces in the pool twisted, whispering. Maybe I'd fooled it enough, but I was still visible. Then there was the dreadful sound of a deep, echoing laugh. The water pulsed like a heartbeat as the skipper took a step closer. His dark eyes gazed intently at mine. "You believe you can evade the ship. You're already a part of it." Fear struck once more, but I made myself concentrate. In the hopes that the flash might break up the shadows, I snatched up my camera and started taking pictures. It worked for a while. Water splashed back as shapes flinched, and I ran, scurrying along the winding corridors. But I couldn't leave the ship. Corridors circled impossibly. Doors went back into the same chamber, and stairwells extended indefinitely. The purpose of the maze was to trap me and keep me within its feeding grounds. With each exit, there were more whispers, more shadows, and more water grabbing for me. At last, at the very bottom deck, I discovered a little service door. It led to a stairwell that was just too little to crawl through. My every step was fueled by adrenaline as I pushed forward. I could hear the chanting rising behind me once more, this time with more intensity and volume, a tidal scream of hundreds of voices united in hate. Finally, I made up to the upper deck. The horizon was dark. No land, no help, just unending waves that go on forever. Sweat and sea spray soaked me as I fell, gasping. However, I was aware of one terrible fact. The Aurora tide didn't give a damn if I got away. It would hold out, it would observe, it would come back, and I would always remember it, the faces in the water, the chanting's echoes, because there are ships that never let their passengers go. I was afraid to close my eyes. Every whisper in the wind conveyed a threat, and every shadow on the deck seemed capable of moving. My hands trembled as I gripped the camera and looked over my photos. Passengers I didn't recall meeting, crew members with hollow eyes, and warped reflections of myself in the portholes were among the faces that peered back at me. The ocean turned blood red as the sun sank below the horizon. As though it were alive, the Aurora tide moaned, bending with the waves and breathing in time with my fear. Then I heard it, a deep, resonant hum that matched the ship's own heartbeat, deep in my chest. The deck stretched, extended, and twisted under my feet as I attempted to run. A black emptiness stretched out beyond the horizon. From the water came shapes, the half-recognizable features of missing people, their eyes wide and beseeching. They reached for me, hovered, and floated, but they never made contact. What awaited those who resisted was being shown to me by the spacecraft. One of the shadows moved behind me. Calm and unhurried, the skipper emerged. "You're not allowed to go," he said. "The ship is able to recall. It makes a decision, and now it has selected you." Desperate, I turned and sprinted in the direction of the bow. The ship's sides were caressed by waves that twisted into shapes that resembled the faces in the pool, hands reaching out to beckon, warn, and claim. The shapes just got closer with each stride I made, stoking the ship's thirst. At that moment, I understood that escape was about submission more than distance. The Aurora tide demanded obedience, fear, and recognition. I was already bound by my attempts to escape and to resist. I was the prey of the ship, which was more than simply a ship. I stumbled into a mirror-like pool of water that had formed on the deck after being suddenly pulled forward. Not as I was, but as I may become, my reflection gazed back at me, white-faced and hollow-eyed, silently grinning, joining the chorus of the ship's victims. The captain held out his hand. "Accepting it makes it easier," he remarked. "While some give up, others fight. The ship retains them either way, but those who give up, they suffer." Before I could respond, the water rushed up and encircled my legs, cold and unforgiving. Struggling, I screamed, but the deck beneath me shifted, changing into a staircase that led to nothing. The chanting intensified, reverberating within my skull and causing my bones to vibrate. Then there was quiet. I opened my eyes. Sunlight. Calm waters. Gleaming white against a flawless horizon. The ship appeared natural. I was able to breathe. I believed I was alive. That is, until I noticed the logbook open on my cabin desk. The words, Lila Martinez, taken, had been written in new ink, and there was a gentle knock on the door. 3 deliberate, slow taps. My heart stopped. I saw her, my reflection, but not quite myself in the fog of the porthole water. Pale skin, hollow eyes, and an unnatural grin. I got it. I had made it through the night just to join the ship's never-ending ritual. Passengers on the Aurora Tide are not released. It won't. And it will know when someone else boards tomorrow. It will make another decision. Welcome on board. Story 5. When the sea is calm, I can still hear the voices, like a whisper on the water, low and soft. However, at the time, I assumed it was simply the sound of the ship's engines humming or the wind moving between the decks. When I went on that cruise, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. Daniel Reed is my name. I'm from Charleston, South Carolina, and I teach history. I had been saving for this trip, a 2-week Caribbean cruise for 2 years. It was meant to be a respite from my classes, from grades, and from the empty house I came home to every night. I hoped that a little sunshine and salt air could help ease the weight that never seemed to leave my chest after my wife's death 3 years prior. The first day was just what I had anticipated. Sparkling pools, happy travelers, and stronger than appearing drinks. I had a tiny but comfortable accommodation with a view of the turquoise water through the porthole. That first night, I recall thinking I would finally get some sleep as I lay in bed and listened to the soft sound of water splashing against the hull. However, I felt a tug. I woke up at around 2 in the morning to an unidentified sound. Not the typical ship groans or creaks as it settles into the ocean. It was more purposeful. A faint, low chant that seemed to be traveling via the ventilation system. It was drunken passengers singing after midnight on a balcony, I assured myself. But in the back of my mind, something wasn't right. When I inquired about it the following morning, the crew dismissed it with a hasty smile. "Sir, just the engines. It takes a night or 2 to get used to." They avoided looking at me, but their voices were courteous. The cruise director revealed later that day that the ship was once a cargo ship before being converted for passenger use during a planned history of the ship discussion in the lounge. That shouldn't have been very noteworthy, but as he said it, I felt a chill go up my back. Cargo ships are made for weight, storage, and transportation, not for luxury. I briefly pondered what precisely this ship had brought before us. The chanting resumed that evening. More volume, nearer. I swear I could hear words when I pushed my ear against the wall. Not in English. It was a wetter, older sound, twisted into syllables like the crash of waves. The hallway was unusually empty, as if the whole deck was holding its breath. When I opened the door to my stateroom, I gave up attempting to fall asleep after the 3rd night. I chose to follow the sound instead. Sneaking along the corridor, barefoot, down stairwells that had a slight rusty and wet rope odor. The farther I got, the louder the chants became. I worried my heart would give me away because it was beating so rapidly. Then I discovered a door that shouldn't have been there at the base of a service stairs. The deck maps I had previously committed to memory did not have it noted. There was only a black metal door with salt stains running across it, no handle, no sign. The chanting rose like a torrent from behind it. I went cold. The voices ceased for a terrible instant, like if they were aware that I was there. The chanting was worse than the stillness. I took patient, methodical steps to retreat until I was back in my cabin's protection. However, I couldn't get rid of the sensation that I was now known to someone or something. I noticed 2 passengers conversing during breakfast the next morning. "Another one didn't come back last night," whispered one of them, a lady in her 60s, leaning in close to the other. Her companion shushed her, but I heard what she was saying. In my hand, my spoon shook. The passengers were disappearing, and when the sounds collected, I had located the door. I was no longer able to ignore the door. I was drawn toward it by every groan of the corridor and every wind whisper coming through the portholes. My heart pounded so loudly that night that I sneaked out of my cabin once more, afraid that it would alert whatever was waiting behind that metal barrier. As though the ship itself were holding its breath, the corridor was darker than normal. Something metallic, coppery, like blood, blended with the subtle scent of brine. I knew the prints left by my bare feet pressing against the chilly steel would disappear before morning. The faint markings, whirling, interlocking designs that pulsed almost imperceptibly in the dim light, were engraved into the metal as I arrived at the entrance. Vibrating through the door, the chanting returned, louder and more urgent. I paused. Curiosity, or perhaps terror itself, drove me ahead despite my logical mind screaming that I should immediately return to my cabin, lock myself in, and summon the crew or the Coast Guard. It was locked, but not in the traditional sense. The symbols shone dimly across my flesh as I pushed my palm against it. Something tried to force me back, like water pressing inward. Then, impossibly slowly, the door opened. There was a room within, damp and rotting, with the stench of the low-tide sea. Even though there was no breeze, the shadows moved and stretched strangely around the walls. The flickering lanterns created unsettling patterns on the stone floor. A sizable circle filled with seawater was carved onto the deck in the middle. In it, vague forms moved, half-formed, like individuals drowning, but never completely. I initially believed I was seeing reflections. Then I understood the shapes were imprisoned, living. They were the ones singing, rising, and falling in time with my own heartbeat. Then I noticed the crew. They remained still, not at all. They were standing in a circle with their heads bent and their hands out. However, their faces had lost their humanity. Their skin had an odd waxy gloss, and their eyes were black pits. Silent smiles formed on the corners of their mouths. I staggered back. A passenger, pallid, motionless, eyes wide open, was struck by a single beam of light in the middle of the circle. As soon as I saw, a hand emerged from the water, grasped the circle's edge, and dragged him beneath. It rippled across the surface, then vanished. The chanting ceased. The silence weighed heavily on my chest. Calm and methodical, the captain emerged at the chamber's door. He said, "You shouldn't be here." Despite not being loud, his voice reverberated across the room. The sea is able to recall. The ship selects its offerings. I attempted to say something. I had a dry throat. "Why are you doing this exactly?" He wore a faint smile. "Not we, the vessel, it insists." The words struck me more forcefully than any wave. We serve until it takes what it's owed. It was more than superstition. In the tales you share over dinner, it wasn't a haunted ship. I was standing in the middle of a ritual, a living, methodical phenomenon. I spun when I heard a sound behind me. Another traveler, whom I knew from dinner, stood in the darkness with their hands folded neatly and their gaze vacant. They didn't say anything, but it was obvious that I would be the next to approach. Gradually, I retreated, stumbling over a snake-like rope. Unblinking, the captain's eyes followed me. Then, as if the water itself had come to life, the floor underneath the circle started to vibrate. A wave came toward me, chilly and thick. I nearly fell as I stumbled and scurried back out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I leaned on it for a long time, pressing my fingertips into the chilly metal while breathing. The deep, continuous moan of the ship amid the storm had taken the place of the chanting. 3 more people had gone missing before daybreak. Beds made, their cabins vacant, possessions gone. The crew only grinned at my question. Their eyes were too black and their manners too courteous. At that moment, I understood that the ship was more than merely haunted. It was more than simply cursed. It was hungry, and it was alive. Furthermore, I was unaware of how long it had been observing me. I had to come out of hiding. Every step I took on the metal decks seemed to reverberate through the passageways, proclaiming my presence, as if the ship had tasted my terror. The remaining passengers were now going more slowly, staring straight ahead and muttering unintelligible things to themselves. I required clarification. I needed to know why the crew had turned into what they were and why this ship required these contributions. Sticking to the darkness, I crept back into the lower service decks. Before I even saw the entrance, the same black metal door from earlier, the origin of every chant and whisper, I could smell the rust and salt. The water inside the circle pulsed once more. However, there were more figures this time. Dozens. Shapes that are partially submerged, reaching, scratching, and silently moaning. Without my knowledge, the chanting had begun, rising in layers and overlapping. I understood that it wasn't originating from a single location, since the sound of hundreds of voices of the passengers who had disappeared, hummed throughout the chamber. With his hands clasped behind his back, the captain stood at the edge, perhaps overseeing a cosmic operation. I saw something horrifying. The crew was not keeping the people in the water as they created a perfect circle around the circle. They were being fed. Every hand movement and head tilt appeared to force life into the ship from the captive bodies. I had a horrible realization. The passengers' bodies and anxiety kept the ship sustained rather than merely alive. It became stronger with each offering and disappearance, enabling it to sail through the storms. The never-ending horizon, the waves, and the lightning were all a part of the ritual, and a sign that the ship's hunger was unquenchable. I nearly fell into the water when I staggered backward. At that moment, I noticed my name engraved on the circle's periphery. It appeared in the water's ripples, not in carvings or ink, as if the ship's invisible fingers were writing it. I muttered, "No," but the circle answered. As though reaching out to me, a wave licked the edge. A hand caught my shoulder as I turned to run. My favorite waiter, a man who had greeted me with a smile on the first day, gazed at me with vacant black eyes. "Now it's your turn," he murmured quietly. Not dangerous. A declaration. An order. A wave of panic swept through. I sprinted, swerving around the hallways and avoiding the main decks, looking for any doors, lifeboats, or staircases that would allow me to exit the ship. However, it wasn't a natural storm. It moved with the ship. Barriers formed by lightning shattering and waves obstructing entrances. The ocean itself seemed to be reshaping itself to ensnare me. I arrived at the observation deck at last. The horizon went on forever. There was only ocean as dark as ink, no land, no help. Subsequently, I noticed the forms emerging from the ocean passengers who had vanished, drifting just below the waves, their faces pressed against the water as if they were attempting to warn me or scream. The ship let out a moan. The wind screamed. I realized then that there was no way out, which was the cruelest truth. I had been taken by the ship long before I had set foot on it. It had been fed by every step I took, every look I cast, and every fear I experienced. The ship's will, which kept me in check, was what caused the storm, not the weather. At the distant end of the deck, a door creaked open. The captain reappeared, as composed as usual, and pointed to me. "Come on, Daniel. The sea is able to recall. The ship supplies. Now you belong here." I yelled and fled. However, the deck twisted underfoot, the water surged, and I was completely engulfed by the horizon. Then there was quiet. In my cabin, I woke up. The sun shone and the sea was still. I initially believed it to be a dream, until the logbook on the desk caught my attention. Open. Pages were blank, save for the words, "Daniel, taken." My cabin door rattled. 3 deliberate, slow knocks. I went cold, since I was aware that the ship wasn't done with me. I remained motionless. Once more, there were slow, deliberate knocks that sounded like someone else's heartbeat. My body resisted my want to run and throw myself into the ocean through the porthole. My thoughts were racing, looking for any weakness, error, or way to break the sense of impending doom. By itself, the door creaked open. A quiet, purposeful swing. No hands, no force. The seemingly endless hallway beyond was illuminated by a faint red emergency light, and there he was, the skipper, smiling slightly and as composed as usual. The team behind him, their black eyes glinting in the light, half human, half something else. "Now you're a part of it," he replied quietly. "Every step you took, every secret desire to flee, every fear it all led you here." I stumbled back, leaning against the wall. It seemed as though the ship had changed and enlarged my cabin, making it seem unreal. The horizon outside the porthole rippled strangely, as though the ocean itself were breathing. The walls throbbed like a heartbeat, and the floor moaned beneath unseen weight. Then I felt it, like water slipping over my feet, cold and viscous. My toes dug into the deck a little. I glanced down. The wood changed from being solid to flowing like a dark liquid. Faces twisted in wordless screams. Shapes twisted beneath the surface. The chanting came back, resonating inside my skull and surging from all directions. I pressed my fingers to my ears and shook my head, whispering, "No, this isn't real." However, the chanting became more intense. I slumped forward as the deck swayed under me. I touched down in the middle of the cabin. In front of me, the logbook was open. As though a breeze only blew within the room, pages fluttered frantically. A hand seized mine as the words, "Daniel, taken. Welcome to the crew," appeared on the paper in dark, damp writing. Chilly, powerful, not human. When I realized I couldn't pull away, my heart froze. Legs, faces, and mouths formed as the figures in the floor surged upward and clawed at me. I let out a cry, but the ship itself muffled the sound. With powerful yet soulless eyes, the captain knelt before me. "Daniel, it's not death. It's a continuation. You provide service. The sea supplies." I made an effort to refuse, but the ship remembers. I hit, kicked, whatever, but it didn't help. The crew drew closer. My legs were encircled by shadows that pulled me below. The air grew heavier, thicker, and tasted of something metallic, salt, and rust that I couldn't identify. Then, there was darkness. On the viewing deck, I woke or believed I did. Calm, limitless, sunlight flashed off the ocean. A cruise ship in crystal clear waters. I rubbed my eyes. Perhaps that was a bad dream. Perhaps I had at last gotten away. Until the logbook caught my eye. Open, nothing. A faint banging reverberated behind me, save for the single line. "Daniel, next voyage," scribbled in new ink. 3 purposeful taps. As like someone or something were pressing against it from the outside, the viewport began to fog. Slowly, I turned, and for a brief moment, I saw myself, gray, glassy-eyed, and grinning like the captain. And I got it. The ship continues. The storm never stops. And I'm a part of it now. Therefore, keep me in mind the next time you go on a trip and the sea seems too calm, the air too dense, and the smiles too flawless. And keep in mind that the ship is always keeping an eye on everything. Welcome on board.